Welcome to the Lore Vault, a quiet refuge where the night settles slowly and old stories drift like ashes on the wind. I speak to you now from a lonely clearing where the world has fallen silent except for the soft breath of a small bonfire. Its glow is faint, fragile, yet warm enough for a wanderer who has walked through more darkness than most can imagine. Gut sits beside it, the dragon slayer planted firmly in the earth, its shadow towering like a monument to every burden he carries. In this dim light, the bonfire of dreams takes shape, a reminder that every soul carries a flame of its own, no matter how small. So settle in, let the night grow still around you. Close your eyes and let the story begin. There are nights I remember more clearly than I should. Nights when the world felt softer, when steel was sheathed and ambition slept quietly beneath the embers. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the rustle of blankets, the faint clatter of armor settling on the grass, the murmured laughter of exhausted soldiers sharing whatever warmth they had left. It was the camp of the Band of the Hawk, a place that felt, for a brief moment in history, like a world suspended between dream and dawn. Picture it with me. Dozens of small bonfires scattered across the field, each one a fragile glow in the dark. The flames weren't bright enough to challenge the night, but they were steady, flickering gently like the heartbeat of a living thing. Around each fire, men huddled close, their shadows bending and stretching with the wind. The Hawks were mercenaries, yes, but in these quiet hours, they were simply people, tired, hungry, human. From where I sat, unseen, unremarkable, the camp looked like a constellation fallen to earth. Each bonfire was a star, and every soldier a dreamer warming his hands over the glow of his own fragile ambitions. But even constellations have a center, and in this landscape of scattered sparks, one flame burned brighter than all the rest, the fire around which Griffith sat. Griffith, the child of winter moonlight, the man who seemed carved from destiny itself. Some said he was born for greatness. Others whispered he was too beautiful, too determined, too luminous to be human at all. Wherever he stood, eyes turned. Wherever he spoke, hearts followed. And wherever he walked, dreams walked with him. His bonfire was not the largest in size, but it was the one everyone gravitated toward. Men who had already settled by their own fires found themselves glancing his way, drawn to the subtle glow that seemed to halo him like a blessing. Some stood and moved closer without knowing why, as if a thread had been tied from their chests to his, pulling them gently toward his warmth. There was something magnetic about him, not because of his beauty, though that alone was enough to capture a room, nor because of his charisma, sharpened by confidence and impossible ambition. It was because Griffin burned with a flame so intense that others wanted to add their own light to it. They wanted to stand near him, to be illuminated by him, to feel important in the orbit of something larger than themselves. Around me, Hawks whispered in admiration, "If it's him, I'll follow. Wherever he goes, we go. I want to see the world he sees." And above it all, the fire crackled softly, as if agreeing with every breath they spoke. What struck me most was how willingly they surrendered their dreams to him. Each bonfire represented a life, a tiny flame fueled by someone's hopes, regrets, and reasons for fighting. The Hawks were not noblemen or knights born into legacy. They were orphans, wanderers, fugitives, and men who had nothing left but the conviction that following Griffith would give their lives meaning again. It was as if each soldier stepped forward and placed his small flame into Griffith's waiting hands. Every story merged into his story. Every life bent toward his direction. Every purpose became an extension of his purpose. Griffith didn't demand it. He didn't need to. His very existence invited people to abandon the uncertainty of their own dreams and surrender to the clarity of his. And that was when I realized something unsettling. Though the night was peaceful, though the fires were warm, something beneath the surface was shifting. Near his fire, Griffith spoke softly about the castle he would one day obtain, a place no one else in the Hawks had ever imagined for themselves. His voice was tender, almost gentle, but inside those words was an ambition as sharp as a blade, a dream that did not leave room for hesitation, a destiny that required not companionship, but obedience. As he spoke, the flames around him surged, brightening as if reflecting his resolve. I watched the men listening to him, their faces lit by the rising glow. They weren't just admiring him, they were offering themselves up to him. They wanted to be the stones in the foundation of his dream. They wanted to be part of the fire that carried him upward. And in this moment of brilliance, I understood the truth. Griffith was a bonfire, brilliant, devouring, unstoppable. Those around him, men who once carried their own small sparks, were slowly letting their lights extinguish, willing to be consumed by his. Not out of fear, not out of force, but out of awe. And while every flame around him rose in unity, there was one person who sat at the edge of the light, watching with eyes that did not reflect the same devotion. Guts. He sat by his own fire, a smaller, quieter one, away from the circle of Griffith's radiance. He listened, but he did not lean in. He did not surrender his flame. And though he respected Griffith, perhaps even admired him, he did not mistake admiration for destiny. Where others saw salvation in Griffith, Guts saw something different. A beautiful light, yes, but not one meant for him. And in that divergence, subtle, silent, unnoticed by anyone else, the seeds of tragedy were planted. When I look back on that night, now I think of the bonfires. Dozens of them, small, fragile, human, each one a life that shone briefly against the vastness of the world, and at the center, one great flame drawing all others toward itself. The band of the Hawk believed they were warming themselves by Griffith's fire, but in truth, they were feeding it, fueling it, becoming part of it. And somewhere on the outskirts of that glowing circle, Guts tended his own quiet flame, not brighter, not grander, but undeniably his. That moment, simple as it seemed, was the beginning of everything. The light, the shadow, the dream, and the burn that would follow. Guts did not immediately understand what set him apart from the others that night, not while the camp was still alive with murmured laughter and drifting embers. Yet as the hours softened and the smaller bonfires dimmed into low orange glows, something inside him settled into a strange, uneasy stillness. He watched the Hawks sleeping near Griffith's fire, men breathing in unison, faces slack with trust, bodies angled unconsciously toward the center of the camp, as if pulled by gravity. Every soul there seemed anchored to the light of Griffith's dream, and the realization drifted toward Guts slowly, like smoke gathering above a fading flame. each person was guarding a dream that was no longer entirely theirs. Their loyalty, their purpose, their very sense of self had bent toward one man without resistance. Their quiet inner fires, those small trembling flames shaped by each man's wounds, histories, and desires, had begun dissolving into the brightness of Griffith's ambition. It struck Guts softly at first, as a subtle discomfort he couldn't articulate. But as the firelight shifted across the sleeping camp, the truth sharpened. All around him, these men who had lived hard, wandered, fought, and survived, had offered up their dreams like kindling. They had placed their small flames into Griffith's hands, letting them burn within the blaze of someone else's destiny. They did it willingly, gratefully even, believing that being part of Griffith's radiance meant their own lives would shine brighter. And perhaps for them it was enough. Perhaps they found relief in surrendering direction, in dissolving into something grander than themselves. But for Guts, the thought landed differently, not as comfort, but as a quiet warning. He glanced down at the fire before him. It was small and steady, flickering in a rhythm that matched the slow rise and fall of his breath. It cast only enough light to trace the edges of his hand, the curve of the dragon slayer resting beside him. It was nothing compared to the bonfire around Griffith, yet it was unmistakably his, a flame shaped by the childhood he survived, by the battles he fought alone, by the scars that no one else carried. It reminded Guts of every step he had taken through snow, mud, and blood long before he ever knew the Band of the Hawk existed. It reminded him that he had lived without belonging, without certainty, without a guiding star. His flame had never been bright, but it had always been his. And for the first time, he realized how easily it could be extinguished. If he drifted too close to Griffith's fire, if he let his life orbit the dreams of that brilliant, unreachable man, then the shape of his own flame would blur. It wouldn't happen violently. It would be gradual, imperceptible, like the way night becomes dawn, without anyone noticing the exact moment it changes. Guts would wake one day and find that his purpose, his path, and even his identity were no longer born from within, but from the gravitational pull of another man's desire. And the frightening part was how natural it would feel. Griffith's presence could make anyone forget themselves, if only for the chance to stand in his light. That thought hit Guts with the force of a blade, not because he distrusted Griffith, but because he admired him so deeply. Admiration, he now understood, was the most treacherous ground on which to surrender one's self. The night grew colder. Sparks drifted upward like the scattered remnants of abandoned wishes. Guts looked again toward Griffith. Even resting, his posture was poised, elegant, untouched by the weariness that dulled the others. A faint smile curved at the corner of his mouth, the expression of a man who saw his dream clearly, even in sleep. Guts respected that clarity. He envied it, but somewhere within that envy bloomed a sharper feeling, the realization that he did not share Griffith's dream, and perhaps never could. He remembered the way Griffith spoke about castles and kingdoms, about standing atop the world and claiming a place no one could deny him. The Hawks listened with eyes wide, their hearts swelling with borrowed purpose. But Guts had felt something else stirring within him during those conversations, a quiet, persistent question he could not ignore. If Griffith reaches his dream, what place will there be for me? Not as a swordsman, not as a tool, but as Guts, a man with no grand ambition, only the instinct to keep moving forward and the faint hope that one day he might discover what he was meant to live for. As that question lingered, The night revealed its answer in the simplest of images: his little fire, trembling but alive. His flame was small because he had never given it room to grow. He had spent his whole life surviving the dreams of others, Gambino's resentment, mercenary captain's commands, and now Grath's destiny. For once, he wanted to see what his flame might become if he carried it alone. A slow breath left him, misting into the air, and in that exhale lay something close to resolve. He did not wish to be consumed. He did not wish to burn as fuel in another man's ascent. He wanted to understand his own warmth, his own path, his own fire. The world around him continued to sleep, unaware of what had shifted inside him. But something had subtle, soft, yet irreversible. A line had drawn itself gently between Guts and Griffiths, not of anger or betrayal, but of awakening. Guts knew now that if he remained in the Hawks, his flame would eventually be reshaped into the image of Griffith's dream, and the cost of that would be the quiet truth he had only just begun to discover. He was more than a sword. He was a man searching for meaning. The fire before him flickered, illuminating his single eye with a glow that seemed almost reflective, as if mirroring a future he could not yet name. In that moment, Guts understood that walking away from Griffin would not be an act of abandonment. It would be the only way to protect the fragile, newborn shape of his own dream. And so, beneath the hush of that night, surrounded by dying embers and borrowed light, Guts made a silent promise to follow the path lit by his flame alone, even if it meant stepping into darkness. It happened on a morning far quieter than any battle, a morning bowed beneath a pale winter sky, when frost clung to the grass and the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of something no one had yet named. The camp was stirring slowly, men rubbing sleep from their eyes, stretching arms stiff from the cold, unaware that the shape of their future was about to change. And walking among them was Guts, quiet, deliberate, carrying a tension beneath his calm exterior that only a few would sense and none would understand. He moved with the steadiness of someone who had spent the entire night making a decision so heavy that it no longer felt like choice, but necessity. His fire had burned low hours ago, yet he had remained seated long after the last ember dimmed, simply watching the horizon lighten, tracing the faint line of his own path within its gray edges. Now, as he walked across the camp, there was no anger, no bitterness, only a resolute stillness, the quiet gravity of a man who finally recognized the weight of his own flame and knew it must be carried elsewhere. The Hawks greeted him warmly as he passed, unaware that they were speaking to him for the last time as one of their own. Some grinned, some clapped him on the back, some joked about sparring later. Their affection was genuine. Guts had earned their respect 100 times over, but even in the warmth of their voices, he felt the unspoken truth he had come to understand by the previous night's fire. They were bound to Griffith's dream, and in serving it, they had allowed their identities to dissolve into that single burning purpose. Guts did not judge them. He did not pity them. He simply knew the path that had shaped them could not be the one that shaped him. As he approached Griffith's tent, an uneasy hush rippled through the air, faint as the rustle of wings. Griffith stepped out, elegant as always, his expression composed, but his eyes carried a searching sharpness, a glimmer that suggested he already sensed what Guts had come to say. For a moment, neither spoke. They stood before each other as leader and warrior, comrade and comrade, two flames whose light had intertwined for years. Griffin's presence was, as always, disarmingly calm, a calm that could make anyone question their own convictions. He asked why Guts was leaving, and the question held no accusation, no anger, just a quiet disbelief, as though something fundamental to the shape of the world was shifting out of place. Guts tried to explain, though the words caught in his throat. How do you voice something that lives more in instinct than language? He told Griffin he needed to find his own path, forge a dream of his own, walk a road not drawn by another's hands. And in hearing it, Griffin's composure cracked, not visibly, not dramatically, but subtly, like a line forming beneath a sheet of ice. For Griffin had always believed that the Hawks were an extension of his destiny, their loyalty a natural truth, their presence by his side as unquestionable as the rising sun. Guts' departure was not a betrayal of friendship, it was a threat to the unspoken structure of Griffin's dream. What happened next has been retold many times by onlookers, but none of them understood the deeper meaning behind the clash. Griffith demanded that Guts prove his resolve by defeating him, a duel for the right to walk away. It was not pride alone that drove him, nor anger, nor even fear of abandonment. It was the realization that Guts was the only person in the Hawks who did not burn within his flame. Guts was the one man who stood beside him as an equal, not as a follower, and losing him felt like losing a piece of the self he had built so painstakingly. Their swords met with a force that shook the cold morning air, the clash echoing across the camp. But beneath the steel, something deeper collided. Griffith's need to keep Guts within the orbit of his dream, and Guts' need to claim the fragile, newly awakened flame of his own purpose. Guts moved with a clarity he had never known before, his blade guided not by rage or instinct, but by the quiet certainty born from the bonfire of the previous night. And in one decisive stroke, he disarmed Griffith, shattering the unspoken hierarchy that had ruled their lives. The moment Griffith fell to the ground, something more than the duel ended. The illusion that their dreams could coexist shattered silently between them. Griffith looked up, stunned not by the pain of defeat, but by the truth revealed within it. Guts' flame had grown stronger than he had anticipated, strong enough to stand alone. The Hawks watched in disbelief as Guts sheathed his sword and turned away. There was no triumph in his step, no gloating, no backward glance. What he carried was heavier than victory, the weight of stepping into an unknown future with nothing but his own fragile fire to guide him. He walked past the men who had fought beside him, past the fires that had once formed a constellation of brotherhood, past the warmth of the only place that had ever resembled a home. The morning air bit at his skin, but it felt clean, honest, a promise of something real. By the time Guts reached the ridge overlooking the camp, the sun had begun to rise, casting long shadows behind him. He paused only once, placing a hand on the hilt of the dragon slayer. Feeling the solid weight of it ground him in the enormity of his choice. Below, the camp was waking, the fires shrinking into pale embers, the men unaware that the shape of their destiny had just altered. Griffith stood alone in the center, surrounded by people who adored him, yet more isolated than he had ever been. And Guts, for the first time in his life, felt the unmistakable clarity of walking a road lit by his own flame. The world ahead was uncertain, cold, and unforgiving, but it was his, entirely his. He stepped forward, leaving behind the bonfire that had once warmed him, carrying instead the quiet, steady burn of his own dream. And as the sky brightened, the wind carried the faint scent of ash, a reminder that every departure is also the beginning of a new fire. There are origins that feel like blessings, wrapped in warmth and the gentle pulse of a heartbeat. And there are origins that feel like the echo of a wound so old and so deep that it shapes a life long before the person ever speaks their first word. Gut's beginning was the latter, a moment not of welcome, but of rejection, not of arrival, but of accident. His first breath was stolen from a world that had already tried to discard him, and everything that followed, every instinct, every scar, every piece of the man he became, was carved from that single truth. He came into existence beneath a hanging tree. The soldiers who found him years later would speak of a scene both horrific and surreal, the swollen corpses of executed villagers, dangling like broken marionettes, their bodies swaying gently in the wind. Among them was a woman whose identity was lost to time, but whose final act left a mark on history. With the last tremor of her dying body, she gave birth. Gut slipped from her womb into the mud, slick with blood and rainwater, crying not into the arms of a parent, but into the empty air of a world that had not prepared a place for him. There was no embrace to greet him, no whispered name, no protection from the cold. The first thing to touch him was the earth, indifferent, unwelcoming, unconcerned whether he lived or died. When the mercenaries found the infant, he was half buried under the corpse of his mother, still gasping at the chill. That he survived even a single night was a miracle so improbable that some of the men later spoke of it as a curse rather than a blessing, and perhaps they were right. For a child born in such a way does not enter the world with a sense of belonging, but with the instinctive question that would haunt him in every relationship thereafter. Why am I here? Even as a newborn, Guts learned his first lesson. The world does not reach out for you. You must claw your way into it. The mercenary Shisu took the child in her arms and for a brief moment gave him something resembling gentleness. She nursed him, tended to him, and despite the filth and danger surrounding them, she spoke to him in a voice that might have grown into love had fate allowed it. But fate did not. She died of plague when Goots was still too young to understand death, but old enough to feel the shift, that sudden disappearance of warmth. He searched for her the nights after she passed, crying in the dark, reaching for arms that would never hold him again. When Shisu died, the fragile thread tying him to affection snapped, and so he was left with Gambino. Gambino did not see a child. He saw a burden, a mouth to feed, a cruel reminder of the woman he lost, an inconvenience attached to a life already filled with hardship. Guts grew under the shadow of this resentment, learning to walk by, dodging kicks meant to express frustration, learning to speak by swallowing the words that might provoke a blow. Gambino's tent was the closest thing he had to a home, yet it was not a place where comfort lived. It was a place where tolerance was conditional, where affection, if it ever flickered, was buried beneath layers of grudging obligation. Every day, Guts absorbed a new lesson. In the people can hold you close, but still wish you gone. And people can feed you but refuse to nourish you. People can share blood with you in battle, yet deny you humanity in the quiet. Childhood is where most people learn security. Guts learned vigilance. He grew up surrounded by warriors, men who bled and drank and cursed their way through life. They showed him how to fight, yes, but they never showed him softness. Their lessons were brutal. Hold the sword tighter, keep your guard up, strike without hesitation, survive no matter what it costs you. None of them taught him how to be loved. He slept among armor and blades, not blankets. He learned to smile through bruises, so no one would think he was weak. And why? He learned that pain was not something to express, it was something to swallow until it hardened into instinct. The world of his early years offered him no refuge, and so Guts grew a shell to replace it. He built it not from arrogance or pride, but from necessity, a layer of emotional armor forged from every moment he had reached out for comfort and found only emptiness. And under that armor, something else grew, a sense of unbelonging so deep that it became part of his marrow. He was alive because he had resisted death, not because anyone had truly chosen him. That truth followed him into adolescence like a shadow, a persistent whisper reminding him that he was an outsider in every place he stepped. As he grew older, the violence around him became the language through which he understood the world. He was handed a sword before he could read, forced into battle before his muscles had even fully formed, encouraged to kill because killing made him useful, and usefulness was the only shield he had against abandonment. For most children, the world is something to explore, and for Guts, the world was something to endure. The mercenaries taught him how to survive injuries, but no one taught him how to survive grief. They taught him how to march, but not how to rest. They taught him how to kill, but not how to heal. And so every wound, physical or emotional, simply accumulated beneath the surface, shaping a young man whose first reaction to danger was not fear, but resistance. By the time he became a teenager, Guts had already internalized the belief that no one would save him, that no one would save him, that no hand would reach out, that the only thing standing between him and annihilation was the sword in his grasp. This belief, carved from trauma, hammered by circumstance, became the foundation for his adult life. It created a man who fought because he had to, not because he wanted to. A man whose instinctive response to affection was suspicion. A man who understood companionship but had no idea how to trust it. A man who guarded his heart so fiercely that even kindness felt like a threat. Yet the deepest mark left by his early life was not anger, nor hatred, nor numbness. It was fear, not the fear of death. He had grown too close to death to fear it, but the fear of connection. Because connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain, the kind of pain that pierced deeper than any sword, the kind of pain he had experienced every time someone who cared for him disappeared or turned against him. So he kept people at a distance, and not to punish them, not to punish himself. For, and not to punish Aladdin and Fursi Pupan in one lonely to two one with they Bixrikni, the Fursi house to run thev to plave, when not to punish himself, and breast to run wed, preparive gats, ain't but to survive. His entire personality, the guarded glances, the tight-lipped stoicism, the refusal to ask for help, was shaped by the knowledge that closeness could crumble without warning. He feared losing people more than he feared losing blood, and so he built his solitude like a fortress, convinced that it was the only way to navigate a world that had rejected him before he could even cry his first cry. Guts did not enter life with a sense of belonging. He entered it with a question, and every wound that followed, every betrayal, every battle, every lonely night echoed that question again and again. If the world never wanted me, then where do I belong? It was a question that would lead him into the band of the Hawk, into Griffith's light, into friendship and heartbreak, into love and ruin. But long before any of that, The root of his struggle was already sown beneath the branches of a hanging tree. The birth of a boy who learned from his very first breath that survival was not a choice, it was his nature. If Guts' early life carved the first wounds into his soul, then the eclipse carved the last, not by deepening the scars he already carried, but by destroying the parts of him that had finally begun to heal. For a man born beneath a hanging tree, pain was familiar, almost predictable, but nothing in his violent, battered upbringing could have prepared him for the horror that descended upon him the day the sky turned red and the world he knew dissolved into a nightmare of flesh and prophecy. Until that moment, Guts had finally begun to believe that survival could mean more than continuing to draw breath. He had found comrades who treated him as an equal, a woman who saw the gentleness beneath his armor, and a dream that felt, if not his own, then at least a place where he belonged. The Band of the Hawk had been the first fire that warmed him, even if it never erased the cold ache at the core of his being. And Griffith, brilliant, impossible Griffith, had been the beacon around which that fragile sense of belonging formed. But the eclipse arrived without mercy, and in a single shuddering moment, it took everything. The loss was not sequential. It did not arrive in pieces that Guts could process one by one. It struck all at once, with the totality and brutality of a cosmic blade descending from the heavens. The moment the brand of sacrifice burned onto his neck, he was no longer simply a man. He was prey. The air thickened with screams, the ground writhed beneath him, and the apostles descended like carrion beasts, drawn to the scent of despair. His comrades, the men who had fought beside him for years, were torn apart as if their bodies were made of paper and not of flesh and bone. Their fear, their confusion, their agony filled the air in a choking cloud. He watched their lives extinguish in front of him. He heard their voices break into pleading in silence. He saw their dreams scattered like ashes in a storm, and he could do nothing. And that was the first part of the trauma, the helplessness, the forced witnessing of a massacre that twisted the meaning of survival itself. Guts had always believed that as long as he fought, he had a chance. But the eclipse was not a battle. It was a ritual, a sacrifice. He was not a fighter in that moment, nor even a survivor. He was a witness to the end of everything he had ever dared to love. Then came the second part, losing Casca. If losing comrades shattered Guts' heart, then watching what Griffith did to Casca carved open the deepest cavity within him, a place so dark and so raw that it would one day become the cradle of the beast of darkness. Casca had been his anchor in ways he never fully understood until she was taken from him. She saw him not as a sword, not as a weapon, but as a man, flawed, wounded, yearning for connection. In the dim light of their quiet moments together, Guts had found something close to peace. Not comfort, perhaps, but the possibility of it. And then, in the eclipse, she was torn from him in the most violent, intimate betrayal imaginable. He fought with everything he had, screaming until his throat tore, clawing at the hands that held him down, pushing his body past the limit of bone and sinew. But he could not reach her. He could not save her. All the strength he had forged through a lifetime of suffering, all the battles he had survived, all the nights he had spent awake honing himself into the perfect soldier, none of it mattered. The hand that had held her gently trembled uselessly. The body she leaned against could not break the restraints of fate. The man who had vowed silently, desperately, to keep her safe, failed in the moment that mattered most. And that failure seeded something inside him, a darkness that whispered, "You were too weak. You cannot protect anything. You will lose everything you love." When Guts woke from the eclipse, missing an eye and an arm, the physical pain barely registered. Wounds of flesh were trivial compared to the void inside him. The world after the eclipse felt thinner, sharper, unreal, as if he had stepped into a reflection of life rather than life itself. The nightmares did not leave him. They crawled into his days, into his thoughts, into every heartbeat. Sleep became the most dangerous enemy of all, because sleep opened the door to the eclipse, and the eclipse opened the door to the monsters that now stalked him. This was the birth of his complex PTSD. It came not as simple fear, but as a mixture of guilt, rage, despair, and a relentless drive to assign meaning to the meaningless. The memory replayed itself endlessly, the screams, the blood, the broken sky, and woven through it was the belief that he alone was responsible, that his decision to leave the Hawks had set Griffin on the path to sacrifice, that if he had stayed, if he had been a better friend, a better soldier, a better man, perhaps the night would have ended differently. Guilt hollowed him. Guilt, hatred filled the hollow. Rage cemented itself around the edges. And in that sealed interior, something new began to stir. The beast of darkness. It did not appear as a demon from outside. It grew from the debris of Guts' psyche, a creature formed out of suppressed anguish and unspoken self-loathing. It was the part of him that believed destruction was easier than vulnerability. The part that whispered, if you kill everything that hurts you, you will never hurt again. If you abandon connection, you will never be abandoned. If you allow me to guide your hand, I will keep you safe. The beast was not entirely wrong. That was what made it terrifying. It understood Guts better than anyone. It knew how much he feared caring. It knew how much he feared losing control. It knew how much he feared the pain of watching someone he loved be taken again. And so it offered him a refuge made of violence, a shelter built from severed ties, a sanctuary with no door leading back to humanity. But the beast was not alone in shaping his new reality. The brand of sacrifice burned on his neck every night, bleeding as the border between worlds thinned. The interstice, a realm between life and spirit, pulled at him like a tide. Monsters sensed it, hungry for the living sacrifice that refused to die. They hunted him relentlessly. Sleep, once a necessity of life, became a threat. Rest was a weakness that could kill him. Dreams were no longer dreamlike. They were corridors opening into the eclipse. And so solitude became not a preference, but a necessity. People near him died. People near him suffered. People near him became targets. And Guts, shaped by a childhood where connection always led to pain, embraced the belief that isolation was the only way to protect both himself and those he cared for. The world that once rejected him now feared him, and he feared himself, feared what he would become if he allowed the beast to guide him fully. The post-eclipse Guts was not simply a broken man. He was a man caught between survival and self-destruction, between wanting to protect and wanting to disappear, between the instinct to connect and the terror of doing so. The brand forced him into ceaseless conflict. The beast tempted him toward annihilation, and the guilt chained to his chest whispered that he deserved neither peace nor companionship. The eclipse did not just scar him, it rewrote him. When he lifted the dragon slayer again, It was not as a weapon, but as an answer, the only answer he had left to a world that felt mercilessly hostile. His journey from that point on was not a quest for glory, nor even for revenge alone. It was a struggle to maintain a sense of self, to protect the faint light still flickering inside him from the storms howling both around and within. A man born from death had once learned to fear connection. A man broken by betrayal now feared himself, and the road ahead would ask him to confront both truths, or be consumed by the darkness he carried. In the long aftermath of the eclipse, when days bled into one another and nights felt indistinguishable from waking nightmares, Guts' life took on a rhythm that was less like living and more like enduring. Battle became his breath, the steady, violent pulse that kept him moving forward when everything else inside him threatened to collapse. Every swing of the Dragon Slayer was a heartbeat, every clash of steel a desperate affirmation that he still existed, still had form, still had weight, in a world that had tried to erase him. Fighting was not simply what he did, it became the language through which he interacted with reality, the only language left that did not betray him. He fought because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. He fought because motion kept the beast of darkness at bay. He fought because if he paused long enough, the eclipse would find him again, in dreams, in silence, in the small spaces where pain seeped through. And so, vigilance fused into his bones. Sleep became a luxury he could not afford. Rest became a threat his body could no longer trust. The brand of sacrifice made certain of that. Each night, when the boundary between worlds thinned, the brand throbbed like a living wound, its pulse warning him of the creatures hunting him from the shadows. What for others was peace, for Guts became a battlefield. Sleep was no shelter, it was surrender, and he had surrendered enough. But not all transformation came from darkness. There was something else that changed during this period, something quieter, subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The way Guts carried the Dragon Slayer, the weapon that once seemed little more than a slab of iron meant to crush apostles, began to reflect something deeper in him. It was a contradiction made tangible, too heavy to be wielded by any ordinary man, too crude to be called a proper sword, yet too necessary to ever be abandoned. The Dragon Slayer was not elegant, not graceful. It was the physical embodiment of a soul that had been battered, torn, and reforged by suffering. It became his burden and his foundation. Carrying it was an act of penance, a constant reminder of the world's cruelty and the weight of the lives he had lost. But swinging it, feeling its impossible mass respond to his will, was the one place where Guts found clarity. In those moments, he wasn't a victim of fate or a survivor of hell. He was simply a force focused and unbroken. The sword gave structure to his anger, direction to his grief, and meaning to his strength. And though it weighed on him like a second body, it also steadied him like an anchor. He needed it. Not only because the world hunted him, but because without it, he feared he might drift away from himself entirely. And yet, for all that the sword provided, it could not substitute what he had truly lost: connection, companionship, a place where his name meant more than a weapon. After the eclipse, Guts believed those things were impossible for someone like him. He believed he was cursed to walk alone, not because solitude made him strong, but because he thought he would only bring ruin to anyone who dared walk beside him. But life, in its strange, unexpected cruelty and kindness, had other plans. and your mad soul. Farnus came first, terrified of him, fascinated by him, trying desperately to understand the darkness she saw reflected in his steps. She did not enter his life as a companion, but as someone searching for meaning, clinging to discipline and faith in ways that shattered upon contact with the real world. Shirka followed, a child witch with a heart attuned to things Guts could not name, possessing a wisdom far older than her body. She saw beyond his rage, beyond the armor of instinct and violence, into the raw wound he carried but never spoke of. Then Isidro, a reckless child whose bravery outpaced his skill, who saw Guts not as a monster to fear, but as a figure to emulate, even if he never understood the weight behind the black swordsman's eyes. They were an odd collection, mismatched, unlikely, fragile in ways. Guts was not, yet through some strange alchemy of circumstance and suffering, they gravitated toward him, not because he asked, not because he desired company, but because something in him, despite the violence and rage, refused to let the world swallow him whole. Something in him kept walking forward, and they followed that motion as if it promised a path none of them could find alone. Guts resisted them at first. Pure fantasy relieved the reading Helid Kirk. He warned them off with harsh words and cold stares. He walked ahead to imply distance. He stayed awake at night so they wouldn't see how violently he dreamed. He kept conversations short, reactions blunt, feelings buried under layers of steel and exhaustion. But the truth was simple. He did not believe he deserved their presence. Every person he had ever loved had suffered for being close to him. Why would these strangers be any different? Yet, despite everything, they stayed. They chose him. Not as a leader, not as a savior, but as someone worth understanding. And slowly, painfully, cautiously, Guts began to choose them back. It started with small things, allowing Isidro to walk beside him instead of behind, allowing Farnese to tend to a wound instead of pushing her away, allowing Shirka to connect with his mind during battles, her magic illuminating the corners of his psyche where the beast lurked. The connection frightened him more than any apostle could. It forced him to see how fragile his humanity still was. Not lost, but trembling, flickering like a candle that had survived too many storms. And then came something even more miraculous: sleep. Not sleep stolen in fits, not unconsciousness forced by exhaustion or injury, but sleep willingly taken, actual rest. The first time he slept deeply, with companions around him keeping watch, something inside him cracked open. He didn't realize how tightly he had been holding himself together until he felt the ache of release, like a rope finally loosening after years of strain. Shirk sat near him, watching quietly, feeling the ripples of his dreams. Farnese kept the fire steady, adding wood whenever the flames dipped too low. Isidro dozed off proudly with one eye open, insisting he could protect everyone, even though he soon snored louder than Guts ever did. And in that gentle, fragile moment, Guts slept. Not as the black swordsman, not as the struggler, not as the man hunted by demons, but as a person, a human being cradled by the security of others' presence. When he awoke, he felt something foreign in his chest, something he had nearly forgotten how to interpret: peace. It was fleeting, yes. It dissolved the moment he heard the wind shift and reached instinctively for his sword. But it existed, and that was enough. The more time he spent with them, the more Guts realized something profound. Survival was not something he had achieved alone. It was something he had forced himself into, because he believed no one else could carry him. But now, these companions, fragile, flawed, stubborn beings, showed him that survival could also be shared. That strength was not always found in swinging the dragon slayer, but sometimes in allowing someone else to shield him, to soothe him, to keep the fire burning while he rested. The transformation was not immediate. It was not smooth. It was not linear. There were nights where the beast surged and he nearly surrendered, days where he slipped back into anger or isolation, moments where fear tightened around him like a noose. But gradually, painfully, wonderfully, he began to shift from the man who guarded everyone else while refusing to be guarded to someone who, in fleeting instants, allowed himself to be vulnerable, to be seen, pure, to be helped, to be held up when his body or spirit faltered. And those moments, small as they were, marked the beginning of true healing. For in the end, Guts' strength was never solely in his power to fight. It was in his ability to rise again after the world tried to break him. But rising alone is not what saved him. What saved him, what continues to save him, is his capacity to connect again, despite every reason not to, because survival is not simply the absence of death. It is the presence of others, and every step Guts takes beside his companions proves a truth he once believed impossible. Even the loneliest flame can burn brighter when sheltered by other hands. There are many ways to understand a man by the choices he makes, the wounds he carries, the people who follow him. But sometimes the truest reflection lies not in the man himself, but in the things he bears, the objects that travel with him through battlefields and empty nights, objects that quietly record the history of his suffering and the shape of his soul. In Guts' case, these symbols are unmistakable: a monstrous slab of iron, a mechanical arm forged from necessity, a cursed suit of armor that devours the mind wearing it, a single fragile flame that refuses to die, and the deep, resonant silence of the nights he spends alone. Taken together, they create a portrait of a man shaped by war, but still stubbornly human. A man who uses steel to fight, fire to feel, and silence to survive. And so, let us begin with the first and most iconic symbol of his existence, the Dragon Slayer. The sword is not elegant. It does not gleam or shimmer like the blades carried by knights of legend. It is not a weapon forged for ceremony or adorned to reflect prestige. It is, in the simplest terms, crude, brutal, too large for any ordinary warrior to lift, let alone wield in the chaos of battle. When one sees the Dragon Slayer embedded in the earth, it resembles not a sword, but a gravestone, a monument marking all that Guts has lost and all that he continues to carry. Its weight mirrors his life, excessive, relentless, crushing. Every swing of the sword is an act of violence against both the enemy and Guts himself. It demands strength almost inhuman, strength forged not through training, but through years of bearing grief like armor. If the Dragon Slayer had been wielded by anyone else, it would have broken their spine. But in Guts' grip, it becomes an extension of his will, a physical manifestation of the rage and sorrow that burned in him after the eclipse. In the early days of his crusade, the Dragon Slayer was revenge incarnate. It was not merely a tool, it was a language, a roar of defiance spoken in steel. Each apostle he cut down was another piece of the agony he carved out of himself. With every battle, the sword drank blood, absorbed curses, and grew heavier with the memories of those slain beneath it. It became a burden, yes, but it also became a pillar he leaned on. When words failed him, when grief threatened to consume him, when the world turned too dark to understand, the sword was the one thing that remained constant, the one thing that met his strength with equal force. Yet the Dragon Slayer also tells another story, that of a man so wounded he must wield a weapon as broken as he is to feel whole. Its chipped edges, its scars of impact, its sheer unwieldiness all resonate with the truth of Guts' existence. He is not refined like Griffith, whose armor gleams with purpose and destiny. Guts is rough, scarred, shaped by violence rather than blessed by fate. His sword reflects this perfectly. It does not slice, it crushes. It does not dance, it cleaves. It does not whisper, it screams. Where the sword reveals the brutality of his path, the prosthetic arm reveals the ingenuity of his survival and the cost at which that survival came. When he lost his left arm during the eclipse, it was more than a physical mutilation. It was a violent tearing away of the last connection he had been clinging to. His hand had been reaching for Casca when it was severed. The wound was not just a cut, but the cruel embodiment of failure. Yet even this loss did not break him. Instead, it transformed into something unexpected, a weaponized expression of resilience. The mechanical arm forged by Godo is functional, but more importantly, symbolic. It is not simply a replacement limb. It is a testament to Guts' refusal to let defeat define him. The arm houses hidden weapons, a cannon, a crossbow, not because he sought to become more deadly, but because he needed every advantage to survive a world that hunted him relentlessly. Where flesh was lost, steel filled the space. Where vulnerability was exposed, engineering closed the wound. This arm is the perfect example of what it means to weaponize pain. Guts does not hide his trauma. He reforges it. He takes the gaps left by loss and turns them into tools, not because he wishes to be stronger, but because he has no choice but to continue fighting. The arm reminds him that even absence can be transformed into function. Even destruction can birth utility, but it also reminds him of the price of survival, that a part of him is always missing, that he is forever compensating for what has been taken, physically and emotionally. Yet, if the sword and the arm represent the outer struggle, the Berserker armor represents the inner war, the one Guts wages not against apostles or fate, but against himself. The armor is beautiful in a haunting way, its contours shaped like the jaws of a beast, its interior carved with dark magic waiting to awaken. When Guts dons the Berserker armor, he steps into a paradox, a weapon that both empowers and devours him. It offers strength beyond human limits, freeing him from pain, from hesitation, from the fragile boundaries of flesh. In the armor, he becomes closer to a myth than a man, unstoppable, terrifying, breathtaking in his ferocity. But the cost is steep, and the armor does not protect the wearer. It uses him. It manipulates the nervous system, overrides the survival instinct, and forces the body to move, even when bones shatter and tendons tear. And beneath the physical consumption lies a psychological one, the beast of darkness, always waiting, always whispering, seizing the chance to overtake Guts when the armor weakens his control. The Berserker armor is the embodiment of self-destructive strength. It gives Guts the means to protect those he loves, but threatens to destroy the very self he hopes to preserve. It is the expression of a man caught between extremes, too dangerous to remain fragile, too human to surrender fully to monstrosity. And somewhere between these symbols, the sword, the arm, the armor, lies the quietest yet most powerful one, the fire. A single flame, a trembling ember, a fragile warmth in the vast cold of the world. Fire is the one symbol not shaped by violence. It is not a tool of destruction, nor an extension of anger. Fire is gentleness. It is humanity. It is the piece of guts that refuses to die, the soft glow that he guards in the rare moments when he allows himself to rest. When Guts sits by a bonfire, he becomes something more than the warrior the world sees. He becomes a man remembering the warmth he once found in the band of the hawk, the quiet nights where dreams seemed possible, even if only in whispers. Fire represents his identity, small, flickering, but unwavering. It is the warmth that keeps the cold of despair at bay, the illumination that shows him he still has a self to protect. Where steel represents war, fire represents meaning, and meaning is what the world nearly stole from him during the eclipse. And then there is silence, the final, perhaps most profound symbol in Guts' life. In silence, he confronts himself. In silence, he feels the weight of what he has survived. In silence, the beast stalks the edges of his mind, but so too does a gentler presence, a reminder of his humanity. Silence is not emptiness for Guts. It is the space where his past breathes, where his fears whisper, where his hopes flicker like the faint glow of coals beneath ash. The wind brushing against his cloak, the soft crackle of dying embers, the vastness of night stretching endlessly above him. These quiet textures form the backdrop of his healing. They are not the silence of isolation, but the silence of reckoning, the silence necessary to understand who he is beneath the scars. When all these symbols are placed together, steel, fire, and quiet, they form the truest portrait of Guts, a man forged in suffering, yet capable of profound tenderness, a warrior who wields weapons heavier than most could even lift, yet guards a flame gentler than most could nurture, a soul who survives through violence, yet searches silently for peace. He fights with iron, but lives with fire. Polly endures with armor, but heals in silence. He walks alone, yet carries the memory of the warmth he once knew. And in each symbol, a truth is reflected. Guts does not survive because he is strong. He survives because he refuses to let the world extinguish the small, flickering flame inside him, the one that says he is still human, still alive, still more than the darkness that hunts him. In the end, Guts chose not the blazing bonfire that consumes the night, but the small flame he could carry in his own hands, a quiet, honest light that belonged only to him. His journey reminds us that we do not need to burn brightly to matter. Sometimes a single warm ember is enough to guide us through the longest, coldest night. So picture him now, the dragon slayer planted firmly in the earth, the last traces of fire glowing softly beside him, and Guts resting at last with his eyes closed, wrapped in a silence that feels almost like peace. And remember, you too are allowed to rest. You are allowed to keep your own flame, small, imperfect, but yours. Let it warm you gently as the world grows quiet. Sleep well tonight, and let your ember glow softly in the dark.